All right, everybody, welcome to this discussion, part three of this discussion, the ignorance of mainstream Christianity regarding Yahweh's law. So we've already seen so far that there is a sharp distinction that the Bible makes between what is called the law of God and the law of Moses, right? Both are supposed to have emanated from Yahweh, but the moral law, the Ten Commandment law, was given directly by Yahweh, voiced and written down by Yahweh, as opposed to the ceremonial and the civil laws, which Moses himself voiced to the people and wrote down himself in a book. Both of those laws were placed into the Ark of the Covenant, right? The two tables of stone and the book of the law, and they were both to be upheld in Jewland, but one was the moral law. The other laws pertained primarily to, ensuring that society was run in accordance with Yahweh's law, the highest law, the eternal law that wasn't to be abolished until sin was done away with, but that the other law, because it was written by and spoken by Moses, it was only temporary. The Bible makes a very clear distinction. Okay, with that said, let's now look at how sometimes the term the law is mentioned in the Bible in a more general sense to refer to both the law of Moses and the law of Yahweh, because both were an integral part of the entire system that the Israel encampment was supposed to be governed by. But when that term the law was used in a more general sense, it was understood by the Hebes when it was used. There was no misconception. It's today that Bible dupes get confused, especially when they're being told that, well, that fourth commandment that's part of God's law, that's not important anymore. Bullshit. But because there's confusion now with so many Christians as to what the difference is between the law of Moses, the law of God, and because the word or the term the law is often used in a more general sense, this is where the confusion comes in. This is how they're fooled into not, recognizing that, biblically speaking, they're not at liberty to trash the fourth commandment. But the hucksters of the cloth, if you will, knowing their ignorance, take full advantage of it and misquote the Bible to confuse them. So, again, it's important to understand this principle, not only to show how frigged up the Christian religion is, but as I said in the last video, also so that you, as one who is hopeful of maybe, waking up some family members or neighbors or friends or whatever who are Bible dupes, this is a good way to do it. This is a good open door to showing them that, hey, look, before you even start to try to tell them the Bible's full of shit, first get them to realize they're being fooled, right? Their own church is suckering them. Show them how their own book isn't being followed by their church. You can show them where they're being misled in their understanding of how significant the law of God is supposed to be. Show them that their refusal or their church's refusal to recognize the Sabbath is a big problem, biblically speaking. Anyways. So here's an example of this. And by the way, the term the law is also sometimes often used to refer in general to the writings of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which is called the Torah, right? Well, the Torah means the law. So sometimes in the New Testament particularly, you'll see Christ talk about the law and the prophets. When he does that, he's talking about the writings of Moses and then the later writings in the Old Testament from, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel. That's what's called the prophets. So when he does that, he's talking about the two different parts of the, what we call the Old Testament now. The law, meaning, again, Moses's books, which mostly deal with the law, right? the Ten Commandments and how they were delivered by Yahweh, and the law of Moses, the ceremonial and the civil laws. So when Jesus says the law and the prophets, that's what he's talking about. The writings of Moses and the writings of the prophets. Uh, this lingo gets lost today in translation, gets lost today because of the ignorance of Bible dupes, and, thus enables them to be easily manipulated by their huckster religious leaders. But back in the day, in Jewland, when terms like that were used, there was no confusion. It was understood what was meant. But anyways, so now let's look at one particular passage which shows that circumcision was considered a part of the old ceremonial law, and yet it's referred to as having been part of the, to prove that it was part of the ceremonial law. Look how it is specifically referred to in this passage as a part of the law of Moses. Acts 15:5. In other words, a clear distinction is being drawn here in the New Testament, that the law pertaining to circumcision, mentioned in the book of Moses, the Torah, is not a part of the Ten Commandment law, the moral law, right? The eternal law. It was a part of the law of Moses, which was not eternal. It was temporal. It was just part of the system of laws that were introduced, the ceremonial and the civil laws that were introduced for the encampment of the Israelites. And so this passage in the book of Acts, for example, makes that point very clear. Acts 15:5 says, then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses. Circumcision was part of what? The law of Moses, not the law of the Ten Commandments, the moral law. And so this is what Paul was complaining about regarding the original followers of Christ. This is one of the big beefs that he claimed to have with them. He really didn't have a beef. Don't forget, Paul participated, the little hypocritical bastard. He participated in a circumcision rite. We're told about that in the book of Acts, right? All the while, though, he's telling his Gentile audience, don't pay attention to those Judaizers in Jerusalem, the original followers of Christ. He called them the so-called pillars of the faith. Can you imagine this little bastard? He's calling the original followers of Christ, who knew a lot more about the teachings of Christ than Paul did. Paul was a latecomer when he hijacked this religion, right? He didn't know hardly anything about what Christ taught, but he reinvented the religion and now started converting Gentiles. This was a big problem in the early Christian church. And so to force Peter's hand, he acted like he loved Gentiles so much. And Peter, you're such a hypocrite. I sit down and eat with Gentiles, but you won't do that. Peter was doing what Jews had always done, right? What Jesus himself did. The one who said, I came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Meaning, I didn't come for Gentiles. When he sent his disciples out on their first missionary journey, he told them, go not into the way of the Gentiles. Go only in the way of the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Don't go out and minister to Gentiles. I want nothing to do with them. Don't forget, he called the Gentile woman a dog who came and pleaded with him to supposedly heal her daughter, right? Go away, you dog! Literally. Oh, yeah. Yeah, he cared about Gentiles, all right. So anyway, now Paul comes along, and he's mass converting Gentiles to this new religion that he realized, okay, you can't beat them, join them. He formerly was persecuting Christians, right? But then it dawned on him, holy shit, the more I persecute them, the more this religion grows. It's a unwinnable battle. Why don't I just join this fucking thing? And then I can recruit these dumbasses to join my insurrectionist movement without them even realizing that they're supporting it. I'll turn it into another Jewish secret society where the masses who join are kept in ignorance of what the real aims are at the top. We'll just use fake symbols and fake meanings for different terms we use. will mean one thing while they think it means another. Exactly. So when Paul talked about the kingdom of God, like Jesus did, the masses were to understand, oh, it's this mysterious, faraway, distant place where Yahweh dwells that we're going to go to be with him one day. Blah, blah, blah. What Paul really meant by it and what Jesus really meant, what all the first century insurrectionists meant who used that same term, was the coming kingdom in Jerusalem, where the throne of David would be set up again. That's the real fucking kingdom of God they were talking about. I already talked about that in great detail earlier on this channel. You can go back and if you haven't heard my discussions on that yet, go back specifically and listen to the series Jesus Under the Microscope. I talk about the first century insurrectionist movement in great detail there and Christ's role in that. His real name, of course, was Judas Crestus, historically speaking. But anyways. But understand this battle that was going on in the early church. Paul came along now, and he's converting Gentiles, and this pissed off not only the general Jewish population, right? The scribes and the Pharisees in particular. Paul was taught by the Pharisees, and he was right along with them, hunting down these Christian heretics, and now he's joining ranks with them and actually having the gall to convert Gentiles to this Jewish branch religion, and then turning around and saying that they are children of Abraham by faith. He's saying that they're being incorporated under the umbrella of Judaism by becoming Christians. This was enraging them. This was heresy at the highest levels, right? Paul got arrested on numerous occasions over this shit. Anyway, so here was this group of Jews now saying, well, if they're going to join this Jewish branch religion called Christianity, these Gentiles must be circumcised as required by the law of Moses in Acts 15:5, right? Because even though Jews really never proselytized, still don't, there are Gentiles, sucker dumbass Gentiles or ass-licking Gentiles who have converted, and they will allow it, reluctantly in many cases, but they will allow it, especially if you're a good ass-licker and they can, use you in some way. They will allow it, but only if you follow their laws, right? And in the Old Testament, in the books of Moses, in Exodus particularly, we see allowance for that. Moses said that, any mixed company that joins with you, meaning Gentiles, that joins with you on the way out, leaving Egypt, and some did, right? When the Hyksos left, some Egyptian ass lickers went along with them, particularly because they were afraid that the wrath of their fellow Egyptians was going to come down on them for sympathizing with these bastards. So anyways, Moses said, those who have joined ranks with you to leave Egypt, there is to be one law between you, or one law among you. You're all to follow the same law. And so, yes, these Gentiles that joined ranks with the Hyksos, they were to be circumcised as well. They were to follow the Ten Commandments. They were to be participating in the daily sacrifices at the well, later it was called a temple. Initially, it was just the tabernacle, this foldable, movable tent. Anyways, you get the point, right? There was a biblical precedent for doing this, for accepting Gentiles. They never liked it. They didn't go out of their way, to welcome Gentiles. No, but that's what was being referred to here in the book of Acts. Okay, well, if you're going to bring Gentiles into this Jewish branch religion called Christianity, you got to make sure they must that they're to be circumcised. But Paul was saying no. He knew that this circumcision thing wasn't going to fly. And in fact, he already saw that it wasn't flying with them. So his tactic was, all right, I'm going to dump that. I'm going to say that was done away with by Christ at the cross. because after all, it's only the moral law that really matters. That's what was written on the tables of stone. That's what was spoken by Yahweh himself. You get what was happening. The original followers of Christ, Peter, James, John, et al., who still worship together in the temple with the rest of the Jews, they didn't like this either. They were still practicing circumcision. And don't forget, so did Paul. Fucking Paul did. Only when he was away from his Gentile buddies, when he went back to visit Jewland, he went into the temple and did participate in, circumcision rituals. He did observe the feast days as well. We have several passages in the book of Acts which talk about him going to Jerusalem for Pentecost and whatnot. He did observe the feast days, even though he told his Gentile audience that the feast days were abolished. We don't need to practice those. That was done away with at the cross. We don't need to practice circumcision. He called his fellow Christian brethren in Jerusalem false brethren. He said they are the so-called pillars of the faith. Just because they're original followers of Jesus, they don't get it like I do. I get my revelations personally from Jesus through visions. They only lived with him and learned at his feet for 3.5 years directly while he was on earth. But I know better. That's literally what he was saying, right? He hijacked the religion and did away with the ceremonial laws. And so now, because Paul dominated this new religion now, Christianity should be not observing the ceremonial laws anymore, circumcision and whatnot. That's over. According to Paul, and the rest of the Christian world now went along with him. Peter, James, and John, he forced their hand because he threatened to create this huge split and the whole Christian religion would go belly up. So they caved into his intimidation schemes, right? Like when he publicly embarrassed Peter for not eating with Gentiles. Not that Paul gave a shit about Gentiles, but for this religion to take off the way he was, directing it, Peter had to be humiliated. So Peter caved. He finally gave in. James, John, et al., they gave in. At first, they resented him. They hated him. But in time, they began to realize, holy shit, I guess he had it right. We had it wrong. We're not going to get anywhere. We don't have enough numbers to override Rome and to infiltrate it the way we want and take control of it. We don't have enough numbers to do that. We've already proven we don't have enough numbers to take over Rome militarily. So we need more people. We need mindless drone goyim that we can deceive with this religion, that we can use as cannon fodder in our little insurrectionist scheme here. And so they realized, yeah, okay, Paul, you're right. Let's go along with this idea. We'll get away. We'll do away with the whole circumcision thing, and on and on and on. We'll say it was abolished at the cross. Christ himself never said that circumcision was going to be abolished at the cross. But when he talked about one jot or one tittle shall not pass away, he was specifically referring to the moral law because of the sharp distinction that the Bible draws between those two laws. Anyway. Now notice a few verses later, after, the one we just read here, Acts 15, verse 5. Notice a few verses later how circumcision is simply referred to as having been part of the law instead of the law of Moses. Here it is, 19 verses later, Acts 15, verse 24. It says, inasmuch as we have heard that certain ones went out from us and have troubled you with words, subverting your souls, saying you must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom we gave no such command. This is Paul talking now, There are those who have subverted you and deceived you. He's talking about the Jews, right? The Christian Jews, like Peter, James, and John, as well as the non-Christian Jews who are still pushing circumcision. Paul is saying, they're wrong. Don't listen to them. They're very crafty. They don't understand the truth the way I do because Jesus has revealed it to me in vision, right? He's just making this horse shit up. And he's lying to them, pretending to be against circumcision when he's really not. He only did this to fool the goyim. But anyways, do notice here how he referred to circumcision as being part of, quote, the law. Whereas previously in this same chapter, circumcision was referred to as being part of the law of Moses. So sometimes it says the law instead of the law of Moses, when in fact it is referring to the law of Moses. But it's understood, it was understood at the time when that was done, that it was in fact specifically referring to the law of Moses, because everybody knew circumcision was not part of the ceremonial law that, is eternal and never to be abolished. They knew that it was a part of the law of Moses, which they thought was still in effect, or they still believed it was in effect because Christ never told them otherwise. But now Paul is saying, no, it's not in effect anymore, doing it just to convert the Gentiles. But Paul could get away with saying that because he was pointing out, hey, don't you remember how the law of God was different from the ceremonial laws? The law of God was written by God and spoken by God, whereas Moses, blah, 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 blah. So Paul was drawing this distinction, and that's how he was able to get away with, getting the other Jewish Christians to go along with this. Well, yeah, Paul's right. It's not really the ceremonial law that's that important, and Christ already died. We know that the sacrificial law isn't important anymore because Christ's sacrifice covers all of that. You get it? So they realized, oh, okay, well, yeah, I guess we can let go of that. We don't have to cling to that anymore. That's how this whole thing got launched. Anyway, in verse 1 of this same chapter, Acts 15, we read, some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. So these were some Christians now who were saying that, yes, because Jesus said, I came not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Therefore, don't break one of the least of these commandments. Not one jot or tittle shall pass, blah, blah, blah. They were saying that, yes, that includes the law of circumcision. You have to be circumcised or you're not going to be saved. Paul was saying, no. That's not part of what needs to be kept. It's only the 10 Commandment law, not the law of Moses. So you can see, again, the sharp distinction that's being made. So, you can tell your Christian believers say, well, you got to get them to realize first that there was this fight going on between Paul, Peter, James, and John. A lot of Christians don't even realize that, guys, even though it's right there in their book. They don't even realize that there was this massive contention. Oh, they know about Paul publicly humiliating Peter, but they think that's just because Peter was ignorant. But that's interesting, though, because that's a wide open door for, helping them to see the light. How come Peter didn't know about that? Why didn't Peter know he was supposed to embrace Gentiles and sit down and have lunch with them? Why didn't the great Jesus ever tell him that? That's a big problem for Christians. But anyway, so, what should be understood today by most Christians and is not is that, A, there's a difference between the ceremonial and the civil law and the moral law, right? They don't get that, number one. Number two, what they don't get from there is the fact that originally Christ's followers were still keeping the law of Moses, the ceremonial laws and the civil laws. They were still keeping those after the cross, except for sacrificing. They weren't doing that anymore. But they were keeping all the other laws. And technically, in fact, that probably still would be going on today, right? Christians today would still be observing all the feast days and practicing circumcision, except for Paul. Paul's the one that brought that to an end. But technically, Paul was right in his argument that, since the laws pertaining to sacrifice aren't in place anymore, obviously, because Christ now is the ultimate sacrifice, all those other ceremonial laws are now abolished. We don't need them. Paul made the point that when you come to Jesus, you're circumcised in your heart by removing sin from your heart, right? And so it's a spiritual circumcision. You don't need the physical anymore. The physical was just an illustration, was the argument that Paul used to point forward to the real circumcision that would be accomplished, when when you would convert to Christ and receive his righteousness, blah, blah, blah. Technically, Paul was right. And so, and this is again why the other Jewish Christians in Jerusalem finally did go along with him, because they realized that his technicality had merit to it. Anyways, here's another passage along this line. This one is Acts 6:13 and 14, which says, and set up false witnesses, which said, this man ceases not to speak blasphemous words against this holy place. Accusations were being made against Paul that he was speaking blasphemous words against this holy place, meaning the temple, and the law. In this context, the law of Moses, because that's what Paul had a gripe with. He wasn't speaking against the Ten Commandments. He was speaking against the law of Moses, meaning the ceremonial and the civil laws. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth shall destroy this place and shall change the customs which Moses delivered to us. So see, when they said the law in this passage, they are referring to the law of Moses, because they're saying that Paul is claiming that Jesus came to get rid of the customs that Moses delivered to us. He wasn't talking about God's law. He was talking about Moses' customs, the ceremonial law, part of which was the circumcision thing, which was, one of the main things that Paul was speaking out against for his Gentile audience. And notice how it also says that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place. It's talking about the upcoming destruction of the temple, right? How Christ said there wouldn't be one stone left upon another. Some people have said, oh, that's not a prophecy. That could easily have been written later on after the fact. No, I don't believe it was, actually. I believe the original character that represented Christ, which was Judas Christus, I believe he did say that. Because that was the aim of the first century insurrectionists. They wanted the temple destroyed. And they planned, as part of their insurrectionist movement, not only to kick the Romans out of Judea and then ultimately to overthrow the Roman Empire down the line, but their aim was also to take down the temple leadership and to destroy the actual temple itself, because the Jewish leaders, there was a few exceptions. There were a few among the Pharisees that favored insurrectionism. Josephus was one of them. But for the most part, they were absolutely adamantly opposed to it, because they knew it would the Romans would destroy the temple, right? They didn't want that. That's their livelihood. They loved the control that they had over the average Jews, right? They loved it. All the money they were sucking out of them. Remember how Christ drove out the money changers? They were way overcharging for the cost of sacrificial animals. They were making a handsome, lucrative business out of overcharging for these sacrificial animals. So, Christ was right when he did that, but he was doing it not because he was so upset with their corruption. He was a corrupt piece of shit too. He did it to arouse the wrath even more of the people against the scribes and Pharisees. He was trying to encourage them to challenge their authority like what he was doing, right? To rise up against them, because they weren't supportive of the insurrectionist movement. So they had to go. They were actually fraternizing with the enemy, compromising with the Romans. So they were seen as just as evil as the Romans themselves. The insurrectionists wanted them taken out. And this is why, when you try to talk to people about Jesus being a fucking fraud, most Bible dupes, some of you have probably seen comments to this effect, right? Right here on this channel. If Jesus was so bad, how come, the Jewish leaders were against him? He was standing up against their corruption. Oh, knock it off. Again, guys, they don't understand the context for the Christian religion coming into being. What was going on in the first century in Jewland? If they did, they wouldn't be raising such stupid-ass questions. All it was Jewish infighting. Jesus was just as much of a Jewy Jew as the temple leaders were, just as much of a Jewish supremacist as they were. but they were arguing over, whether or not we should lick Rome's ass and keep the peace. That's it. That's all they were arguing over. They were both rabidly Jewish, other than that. Just Jewish infighting. And Christ also resented not only that they weren't standing up against the Romans, he resented that they weren't accepting him as the big man on campus, the Messiah. Oh, that really enraged him. Anyways, let's look at some passages now which refer to the ceremonial law simply as the law. Again, we already looked at one. Let's look at some others along this line. Hebrews 8:4 says, "For if he, Christ, were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law." Here, assuming Paul wrote Hebrews, here Paul is talking about the law of Moses, right? And anyone at that time who read this would have known what was being referred to here, that it was not the Ten Commandment law. In this context, the law is referring to the law of Moses. That's what prescribed sacrifices, what sacrifice to perform, when to perform it, how to do it, what animal was to be used, blah, blah, blah. That is the law of Moses, or the ceremonial law. The word the law here is not the Ten Commandment law. Here's another example, again from the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 22. It says, "And almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without the shedding of blood is no remission." He's talking here about the ceremonial law. Once again, the law that prescribed sacrifices, right? And by the way, notice that reference to without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. How Jewish is that? Think about it, guys. Think about it. The God that so many mindless goyim worship week after week, day after day, begin their day with prayer, end their day with prayer, and are muttering silent prayers to themselves all during the day. This same piece of shit, Old Testament and New, upheld this idea that sin cannot be remitted without the shedding of blood. So in the Old Testament, you had to massively shed the blood of this, that, and the other animal. Sometimes human blood, right? Don't forget, Yahweh commanded his chosen pets on many occasions when they were going into this, that, and the other city to steal their land. He told them to burn the city with the inhabitants thereof, and it shall be a burnt offering unto the Lord, a sweet-smelling savor. Human sacrifice, right? And of course, the ultimate human sacrifice for Mr. Yahweh was supposed to be Jesus himself. Can you imagine? They worship a God that would say, the only way I'm going to forgive you of your sins is if you shed blood. Either blood of an animal or human blood, or accept the blood of my son now, supposedly, as the remission of your sin. What a fucking piece of shit, guys. Think of it. Christians will often say, well, no, it's not that God had a choice. Sin requires that. A natural result of sin means death. Bullshit. Yahweh is the rule maker, right? Bible dupes? All things are possible with God. With God, anything can be done. He made up these rules himself, you stupid asses. That's his game. He's the one who said blood must be required. The same one who said that could also have simply said, hey, all right, you guys, you fucked up. I didn't want you picking that piece of fruit, but, quite frankly, that piece of fruit on that tree, that was kind of arbitrary of me anyway. Nevertheless, you did something I told you not to do. It is naughty, but it's not a serious offense. So, it would be horrible of me, totally unjust, to not only punish you with death and misery and suffering and sorrow and disease and murder and, years and years of thievery and all kinds of heinous diseases. It not only would be unfair and unjust of me to punish you, Adam and Eve, but all of your offspring for thousands and thousands of generations to come. It would be totally unjust. So me, being God, I have the power simply to say, I forgive you. That's all he had to do, the little fucking prick. according to the Bible, right? Bible dupes never stop to contemplate how incredibly unjust, unfair, how psychopathic it is for that son of a bitch not only to have not been merciful and just and said, hey, you fucked up, I told you not to, but I'm going to forgive you, I'm going to give you another chance, whatever. The son of a bitch is the one who put that tree there in the garden in the first place. Don't forget, guys, he set him up through entrapment. He puts the tree there, and then he knows that the little snake, according to the story, right? The story's bullshit, but going by this story, this is what Bible dupes accept as real history. Okay, fine, it's real history. Look how sick and disgusting this fucking story is. He knew the future, right? Yahweh knows all before it ever happens. He knew that in putting the tree there, he was setting them up, and that he knew also that the snake was going to come along now and tempt Eve and deceive her, right? The Bible says she was tricked. She was tricked. Yahweh didn't take that into consideration either. Well, you didn't do it defiantly, snubbing your nose at me and saying, screw you, I'm going to do it anyway. Yahweh's got a long history of that, doesn't he? Remember the story of Uzzah and the Ark of the Covenant falling? Uzzah reached out, according to this story. He saw that the Ark was going to fall and probably get severely damaged. So he reached out to catch it. Yahweh had said, don't ever look into the Ark and don't ever touch the Ark. The minute you do it, I'll fry your ass. Well, here it was. Uzzah was not saying, hey, Yahweh, remember you told me not to touch the Ark? Well, fuck you. I'm going to touch it anyway. No. This wasn't an act of rebellion. Uzzah reached out of concern for the Ark. He didn't want it to get damaged. As soon as he touches the Ark, according to this story, Yahweh fried his ass right there on the spot. Bang! Drop dead. You gotta be fucking kidding me, man. That is so goddamn disgusting. And yet, how much you want to bet if he didn't reach out to catch the Ark and thought, oh, wait, I want to catch it. I want to save it from getting damaged. But shit, I was told not to touch it. If he had enough time to think this out, he probably would have said, fuck that. I'm not going to touch it. Yahweh's going to zap me dead. I'll just let it crash to the ground. How much you want to bet if it crashed to the ground, Yahweh would have said, you son of a bitch, you didn't stop that. You saw that. You knew it was going to get damaged. You didn't stop to intervene to stop that. I'm going to fry your ass for that. Damned if you do, damned if you don't with Mr. Yahweh. Son of a bitch, guys. Can you imagine? The Christian world calls this prick loving and just when you've got stories like that. And of course, there's far worse stories than that in there. But just that alone, he didn't just fry the ass of the heathen that worshipped false gods. He fried his own chosen ones' asses if they didn't do everything exactly how he said, when he said, where he said, why he said. You had to follow every stipulation exactly as the tyrannical prick in the sky said, or yeah, you'd get your ass fried, Hebrew or not. What a piece of shit. Why does anybody worship this fuck? Never mind dumbass Goyim Gentile. Why? Jews themselves. Do they not see what a prick this son of a bitch is? They're taught well, though, aren't they, guys? They're taught well from the time they're very young to have no scruples, especially when it comes to Gentiles. They're taught that their despicable God and his despicable behavior is holy, just, and righteous. And that's why Christians, Goyim as well, defend the son of a bitch, just like the Jews do. You can't convince a Christian any more than a Jew that their God is a piece of shit, because in their mind, they've been so inundated with bullshit propaganda. They've been so completely brainwashed that they can't recognize this thing as the immoral thug that it is, even though it's right there in their face in black and white before their eyes on the pages of the very book they read on a daily basis. They can't see that the son of a bitch is an immoral fuck because they've been convinced that he is not only moral, he invented morality. Bull fucking shit he did. Guys, yeah, again, it's mind-blowing what the human mind, which has the ability to think critically, analytically, sensibly, and yet it can be led to believe shit like this. and you can't reason with them. Once they've accepted it, you cannot reach them, even though it's the most common sense, fucking easy to figure out shit right in your face. You can't reach them. They're gone. It's like Trump supporters, right? Somebody in the comments called Trump supporters Trumpanzees today. I love that one. I'm gonna be using that from now on. Trumpanzees. Yeah, it's just like Trumpanzees, right? You can show them all the shit that he's pulled, all the lies that he's told. You can show them how he licks Israel's ass. Well, that's not going to do you any good with the Christian Zios, is it? To them, that's one of the good points, that he's licking Jew ass. They love that he kisses Israel's frickin' hindparts. But nevertheless, guys, all his criminality, all his connections with the Russian mob, on and on and on, it's just going to go in one ear and out the other. The same with Bible dupes, in one ear and out the other. Doesn't matter how much evidence you can present to them, right from the pages of their own book. It's just going to bounce right off of them. Fucking astonishing. Anyway, back to our notes here. This is another very interesting passage, also from the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 10, verse 1. There's many things that I got to point out from this verse here. Anyway, assuming Paul wrote this, he said, "For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of those things, can never, with those sacrifices which they offered year by year, continually make the comers thereto perfect." Paul here is talking again, not about the Ten Commandment law. Ten Commandment law has nothing to do with offering sacrifices. This is the law of Moses, right? But notice how he said that this law is only a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of those things. He's talking about the law of Moses, particularly regarding the laws pertaining to sacrifice, how they weren't the real thing. They were only a shadow pointing forward to the real thing, meaning supposedly Christ's sacrifice, right? And now that Christ has sacrificed himself, we don't need all those sacrificial laws anymore. That's been abolished. And so he's making the argument, just like we don't need the sacrificial laws as part of the law of Moses, we don't need all the other laws under the law of Moses either, like circumcision. He's telling this to his Gentile audience. But notice how he says that these laws, the Mosaic laws pertaining to sacrifice, can never, with all of those sacrifices which they offered year after year, could continually, those sacrifices could never make the presenters or the comers to perfect. In other words, Paul is saying that all those sacrifices that were required every day, day after day after day, thousands and thousands and thousands of animals, week after week after week after week, millions by the end of each year, all that bloodshed, all that misery, all that suffering, slow, painful, kosher deaths, right? Cutting their throats, hanging them upside down. All of those sacrifices, he said, were really pointless because they didn't accomplish anything. Isn't that something? Yahweh instituted this system of sacrifice, which he gave to Moses to write in the book of the law, and yet it was for naught. It was for nothing. All those animals, all that suffering, right? For nothing, because only the real sacrifice of Jesus is what can take sin away. Paul states it emphatically that while he says without the shedding of blood there's no remission, what he meant was Christ's blood, and that the blood of goats and bulls, he says this later on in the book of Hebrews, the blood of goats and bulls could never take away sin, he says. And yet the prick Yahweh instituted this horse shit when it served no purpose. Just an illustration. I want you to kill all these animals. And then don't forget, every year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, a special pair of goats were picked for this one special sacrifice, which were supposed to take care of all the sins of the previous year. Well, wait just a fucking minute. Why were all of those other animals slaughtered every fucking day when these two goats, one was slaughtered, the other one was let go, the Azazel, right? The scapegoat was let go into the wilderness. But nevertheless, both of those goats were supposed to take care of all the collective sins of the previous year. When one was slaughtered, the price was paid, the death was meted out. The other one was let go. That was to die in the wilderness of its own. And it also had the sins of the collective sins of the people from the previous year confessed over its head. So both the goats died in different ways, but they both died, and that was to atone for sin from all the previous year. Do you see my point? If that was the purpose of this exercise on the Day of Atonement, then why the fuck did they have to, sacrifice every single day for every single sin? You see what a prick, again, Yahweh is for instituting this system, even though Moses spoke it and Moses wrote it. Supposedly, he got it from Yahweh, right? So the blame for all this shit must fall in the lap of Mr. Yahweh. What a motherfucker, man. Which is why I'll say once again, I've said it many times before, even if Yahweh were real, fuck him and the camel he rode in on. What a piece of shit. Oh, but there's many more reasons for saying that about Mr. Yahweh. Not just this sacrificial bullshit. That's a good one. But, there are many others even worse than that, as I've been pointing out for years now on this channel. Here's another passage along this line. This one's from Leviticus, the Old Testament now, chapter 6, verse 25. It says, "Speak unto Aaron and to his sons, saying, this is the law of the sin offering." So there you go, the law of the sin offering. This has nothing to do with the Ten Commandment law, right? "In the place where the burnt offering is killed, shall the sin offering be killed before the Lord. It is most holy." Yeah, whatever. So here's Yahweh commanding blood sacrifice. When Paul came along later and said, it was all for naught, it didn't serve any purpose, it was just for illustration. All the misery, all the suffering. And again, it didn't have to go on every day, right? There only needed to be 2 goats per year on the Day of Atonement, which was supposed to cover all the sins from the previous year. So why all those other fucking slaughterings every goddamn day during the previous year? It was totally unnecessary, according to what Paul said. It's unnecessary regardless what Paul said, right? If Jesus' sacrifice was to take care of all sin for all time, past, present, and future, why were there any goats that needed to... Bible dupes would say, God did that so it could point forward to the sufferings of Christ. They needed that just to illustrate. Oh, yeah? Well, then why aren't we sacrificing anymore, dumb shits? If they needed to sacrifice in the past, before the cross, to point forward to Christ, why aren't we still sacrificing now to point backward, you dumb shits? Their logic is not logical at all. It's more apologetics. Bullshit is what it is. Again, guys, the fact that a supposedly all-loving God would ever require bloodshed at all in order for you to be forgiven of sins is complete bullshit. And in order for you to live eternally. Don't forget, guys, in the Garden of Eden, to prove my point that Yahweh didn't have to resort to sacrifice of anything, he could have just said, hey, I forgive you, let's start over fresh, right? He's God, he can do anything, he makes up the rules. But to prove that, don't forget, after the fall in Eden, according to the bullshit narrative in the book of Genesis, after the fall in Eden, Adam and Eve, even though they picked the fruit and now were subject to death, they could have lived eternally, according to the story, if they had eaten from the tree of life, which is why we're told Yahweh put an angel with a flaming sword, whatever the fuck that means, to guard the tree of life so that Adam and Eve wouldn't eat from it and thus live. Imagine that. So we didn't need Jesus' sacrifice to live forever. All we need to do is eat from the tree of life. Yahweh could have done it another way. It didn't have to involve this gory-ass fucking bloodshed sacrifice, according to this bullshit story, right? But do you see how the arguments Christians use are so full of shit? God couldn't have saved us any other way. It was only through the shed blood of his son. Bullshit. Bullshit. And as far as remission of sins, the Bible presents another way that could happen. There's the story of, Ezekiel I mentioned before, right? Where in vision, he's told to take some tongs and grab this piece of coal from a fire and to touch it to his lips. And that would result in, his sins being forgiven. So there's other ways of sins being remitted, other ways of achieving eternal life, according to the Bible, without having to involve a bloody, gory-ass fucking sacrifice. What a piece of shit book this is, man. I'm telling you guys, the whole fucking thing. It is so goddamn disgusting. And yet, look how much it is influenced, corrupted, perverted, twisted, inverted, uh, just across the board, messed up Gentile society for the past 2,000 years now. And mostly because of Paul and his Gentile conversion bullshit. Unreal. Anyway, guys, I was hoping this was just going to be in 3 parts, but we're just about at the hour mark now, and I'm about to start another section of these notes. I don't want to do that at this point because it's going to go for a long time, so I'm going to have to carry this over into another video. Hopefully, I won't ramble too much in the next video so I can finish this. I don't want to beat this thing into the ground forever. But, this is an important concept to understand, especially when we get into the next phase of this discussion after the next video that's going to complete this one. When we get into an actual discussion of the Shabbat, of the Sabbath, that's when all of this previous discussion here is really going to click. And you're going to see why this has been so important, especially if you want to not only want to understand how messed up modern Christianity is for the most part, but also if you want to be able to reach out to any Christian friends the decent ones. The assholes, just tell them to fuck off. The arrogant ones that condemn you as a sinner and you're lost forever. And, I'm good, you're bad. I know what morality is. You don't have God. Fuck them. But the ones that actually are sincere, and they don't seem to be too large in number, but, the decent ones among them, like what my mother was, you want to go, walk gently, softly. You don't want to just come out and say dumb Bible shits. No, you're never going to get them that way. Reason with them from their own book. Take some of these tips here. Use some of these passages I'm referencing and, ask some questions. Sometimes it's better than making statements. Ask questions instead. Don't you find it a little strange that your church is teaching you to observe the first day of the week, Sunday, instead of the seventh day of the week, Saturday, which is really the Sabbath? It's the Jewish Sabbath, right? That's the day the Jews keep. Don't you find it a little strange that, this is one of the 10 Commandments, right? You do believe in the 10 Commandments, don't you? So you can get a discussion going. Ask them questions like that. Get them thinking, And you know what most of them do, though? I got to warn you ahead of time. A lot of times, they don't even go back to the Bible and look the shit up that you share with them. They go to their fucking minister. They ask him, well, he knows better than me. And so when they come back to you, they're going to give you what he said. But always, always come back with what the Bible... Say, oh, that's interesting, but let's look a little more closely. What do you think of this passage? Eventually they're going to realize, geez, hopefully, if they really are seeking truth, they're going to realize that, wow, what my minister's saying doesn't make sense. What my neighbor here is telling me and showing me right from my own Bible is making more sense than what he's saying. This is how you do it, guys. If you want to really set them free from the clutches of this fucking book, you got to go this roundabout route and use the Bible itself to reach them. Anyways, guys, thanks for joining me. Part 4 should be the end of this discussion, as long as I don't ramble. We'll catch you then. Take care, folks.